From an amendment meant to save the American family, to a decade of gangsters getting rich off illegal booze, to the only amendment in American history that was repealed. This is Prohibition Explained, a law so unpopular it turned ordinary Americans into criminals overnight, and made organized crime so powerful that mob bosses were walking into police stations and paying off the chief. The United States tried to ban alcohol. What happened next was one of the greatest policy disasters in American history. But let's rewind. Because Prohibition didn't just come out of nowhere. It was decades in the making. And it started with something surprising. Women. By the 1820s, America had a drinking problem. And I mean a serious one. The average American over the age of 15 was consuming the equivalent of 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. That's about 3 times what we drink today. Men were spending their paychecks at saloons while their wives and children went hungry. Domestic violence was rampant. The saloon became the symbol of everything broken in American life. And the people who decided to do something about it were largely women. The Women's Christian Temperance Union formed in 1874. They marched. They prayed. They stood outside saloons singing hymns until the bartender closed up. They gathered signatures. Millions of them. Their argument was simple and hard to argue with. Alcohol destroyed families. If you wanted to protect women and children, you had to get rid of the bottle. But the movement really caught fire when it found its general, a woman named Carrie. Carrie did not just sing hymns outside bars. She walked into saloons with a hatchet and smashed bottles, glasses, mirrors, anything that held or served liquor. She was arrested more than 30 times. She paid her fines with money she earned selling souvenir hatchets, and she became a national celebrity. By the 1890s, the temperance movement had real political muscle. The Anti-Saloon League formed, and they did something no activist group had ever pulled off before. They went single issue. They didn't care if a politician was a Republican or a Democrat. They only cared about one question. Are you wet or are you dry? If you were wet, they would campaign against you, relentlessly. And it worked. By 1916, 23 states had already banned alcohol on their own. Then World War I gave the movement its final push. Breweries in America were largely owned by German immigrants. The war made anything German look unpatriotic. And grains used to make beer and whiskey were needed to feed soldiers and allies. Suddenly, banning alcohol didn't just sound moral. It sounded patriotic. In 1919, Congress passed the 18th Amendment. It banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. 36 states ratified it. Then came the Volstead Act, which defined intoxicating as anything over 0.5% alcohol. That meant beer, wine, whiskey, everything. Gone. On January 17.1920, Prohibition became the law of the land. The entire country was supposed to go dry. And on paper, it did. Bars closed, breweries shut down, saloons boarded up their windows. But on the ground, something else was happening. A lot of Americans had no intention of giving up drinking. And when you ban something millions of people want, you do not eliminate demand. You hand the entire market to criminals. And the first people to figure this out were already in place. Before Prohibition, organized crime in America was mostly small-scale, neighborhood gangs, protection rackets, gambling, nothing national, nothing with the kind of money that buys politicians and judges. But bootlegging changed the map, because alcohol is cheap to make and easy to sell. And during Prohibition, a bottle of whiskey that cost a few dollars to produce could sell for 20 or 30. The profit margins were staggering. And where there is that much money, violence follows. Enter Al Capone. Capone was not the first bootlegger. He was not the most violent. But he understood something that almost nobody else in the underworld did. If you control the supply chain, you control the city. He set up a network that brought Canadian whiskey across the Great Lakes, rum from the Caribbean into Florida, and industrial alcohol diverted from legal factories all over the Midwest. He built a fleet of trucks. He bribed cops, judges, mayors, and at least one governor. By the late 1920s, Capone's operation was pulling in over $100 million a year. In today's money, that is well over $1 billion. He walked around Chicago in a tailored suit with a fedora and a diamond tie pin, holding press conferences like he was the mayor, which, in a way, he was. But the violence was not just a byproduct. It was the business model. When another gang tried to move in on Capone's territory, the response was immediate and lethal. The most infamous example happened on February 14.1929. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 members of a rival gang, Bugs Moran's North Side outfit, were lined up against a garage wall and executed by men dressed as police officers. 2 of the shooters were carrying Thompson submachine guns. The Tommy gun became the symbol of the era. The massacre made national headlines. Americans who had supported Prohibition started asking a question they had not considered in 1919. What if banning alcohol is actually making things worse? And Capone was just the most famous. Every city had its own version. The Purple Gang in Detroit, the Kosher Nostra in New York, the Shelton Brothers in St. Louis. Prohibition did not stop drinking. Americans drank as much as ever. Speakeasies popped up everywhere. Estimates put the number between 30,000 and 100,000 in New York City alone. Underground bars hidden behind fake doors and laundromats. Barber shops, funeral home. You needed a password to get in. Inside, the music was jazz and the drinks were terrible. Often homemade gin that tasted like rubbing alcohol. But that was not the point. The Great Depression was the final nail. By 1931, the country was in economic freefall. Unemployment hit 25%. The federal government was desperate for revenue. And prohibition was costing money in two directions at once. The government was spending millions trying to enforce a law nobody wanted. And it was losing billions in tax revenue that legal alcohol sales would have brought in. A lawyer named Pauline Sabin, who had originally supported prohibition, switched sides and founded the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. Her argument shifted the entire debate. She didn't say alcohol was good. She said prohibition was making America lawless, corrupt, and broke. And by then, most Americans agreed. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified. It repealed the 18th. Prohibition was over. It remains the only time in American history that a constitutional amendment has been undone by another amendment. The experiment lasted 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days. What did it leave behind? It did not end drinking. It did not save the American family. What it did was create organized crime on a national scale. Before Prohibition, the Mafia was a collection of local rackets. After Prohibition, it was an institution with political connections, money laundering operations, and enough cash to go legitimate once liquor was legal again. The mob didn't disappear when Prohibition ended. It diversified into gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and eventually, narcotics. Capone himself went to prison in 1931, not for bootlegging, not for murder. The federal government could not pin any of those charges on him. They got him for tax evasion. He spent his final years in Alcatraz, then retired to a mansion in Florida, his mind deteriorating from untreated syphilis. He died in 1947. So when people ask whether Prohibition worked, here is the honest answer. It worked if your goal was to put Al Capone in a diamond-type pin. It failed at everything else. America tried to legislate morality. The morality stuck around for about 15 minutes. The organized crime stuck around for 50 years. And the only constitutional amendment ever to be undone was undone because almost nobody wanted it anymore. Today, the Prohibition era is remembered as a cautionary tale. Not about alcohol. About what happens when you ban something millions of people want. And hand the entire market to people who don't care about the rules. Next time, we go back further. The Salem witch trials. 20 people dead. A village paralyzed by fear. And the real reason it happened might have been a poisoned loaf of bread. See you then.